Back in the summer of 2025, the Caribbean Sea became the setting for a massive geopolitical showdown. We're talking about the largest U.S. naval deployment in the region for decades. This is the story of Operation Southern Spear, a full-on naval blockade that pushed an entire nation to the edge and completely redrew the global map.
So it all kicked off in late August. Suddenly, you've got warships, a nuclear submarine, and thousands of sailors and Marines all converging on the southern Caribbean. I mean, this was a military buildup like we hadn't seen in a long, long time. And of course, the big question on everyone's mind was pretty simple. Why? And why right now?
Okay, so to get to the bottom of that why, we've got to start with the official story. On paper, the mission, which they called Operation Southern Spear, had a really clear objective: to go to war with narco-terrorism and stop the flood of deadly drugs coming into the United States.
And the message coming from the very top? It was absolutely unambiguous. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made it crystal clear to the troops this was not some training exercise. The language he used was incredibly stark, framing this whole thing as a direct defense of the nation against, in his words, the poisoning of the American people. So, right from the get-go, the stakes were set incredibly high.
Now you have to understand, this didn't just happen overnight. The administration spent months, literally months, laying all the legal groundwork for this. It kicked off in January with an executive order to label drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. By July, that label was slapped on the cartel of the Suns, which the U.S. claims has direct ties to the Venezuelan government. Then doubling the reward for President Maduro's capture, well, that just cemented where the focus was. And this legal footwork is so important because it totally changed the game. These weren't just law enforcement actions anymore, they were now officially counterterrorism operations, which legally swung the door wide open for military force.
Okay, but here's where the official story starts to get a little shaky. I mean, if the main target was fentanyl, the drug causing the most harm in the US, why send a massive naval fleet to the Caribbean? All the data shows that the vast majority of fentanyl comes from Mexico and is smuggled over land. The hardware just didn't seem to fit the job description. It felt like bringing a sledgehammer to fix a watch.
And that leads us to what many analysts believe was the real motive, something that went way beyond the war on drugs and pointed to a deeper, resource-driven strategy, a strategy that had Venezuela right in its crosshairs.
I mean, just look at the raw military power difference here. It's not even a contest. On one side, you've got the overwhelming might of the U.S. Navy, and on the other, Venezuela's coastal defense, which is just completely dwarfed. This kind of overwhelming force seemed like massive overkill for just stopping drug boats. It looked a lot more like classic gunboat diplomacy, designed to project power and put the squeeze on an entire country.
And this is the potential prize. Venezuela is sitting on top of the Orinoco Belt, one of the biggest stockpiles of crude oil on the entire planet. So for a lot of people watching this wasn't really about stopping cocaine. It was about securing access to a huge strategic resource, especially with global energy markets going haywire. This was the unspoken why behind the whole operation. So let's get into the second act of this whole thing, because this is where it really heats up. What started out as just a naval presence, a bit of posturing, very quickly escalated into a series of deadly, kinetic strikes. It basically turned the Caribbean into a live conflict zone.
And then the strikes started coming, fast and hard. It began on September 2nd, with 11 people killed on a boat the U.S. tied to a gang called Tren de Aragua. Then another strike, and another. Just look at the dates. The pace was relentless, happening every couple of weeks. This wasn't a Cold War anymore. It was hot, and there was a rising body count right there in the waters off Venezuela.
The initial deployment was already pretty big, over 4,500 sailors and Marines setting up the U.S. presence in the area. But that was just the start. By late October, the number of troops had more than doubled to 10,000, split between the ships at sea and bases in Puerto Rico.
And then came the real game changer. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, showed up with its entire strike group. That pushed the U.S. presence to a jaw-dropping 15,000 personnel, a force that was way, way beyond anything you'd need for a routine mission.
So now you have this massive carrier strike group on the scene, and that sets the stage for the operation's climax. This was the one single event that took this pressure campaign and turned it into a full-blown economic blockade.
On December 10th, it all became crystal clear what this was really about. U.S. Special Forces launched in helicopters right off the deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford. They boarded and seized the Skipper, a sanctioned oil tanker that was operating just off the coast of Venezuela. This was a huge, dramatic, and very direct escalation.
Now, to really get why seizing this one ship was such a big deal, you need to understand something called the shadow fleet. This is basically the financial lifeline for sanctioned countries like Venezuela. It's this global network of ghost ships, old tankers with shady ownership that lets them sell their oil on the black market, mostly to China, and keep their government funded. So by grabbing a vessel from this fleet, the U.S. was taking a direct swing at the Maduro regime's main source of cash.
And just 1 week later, if there was any doubt left, it was completely wiped away. President Trump came out and declared a total and complete blockade. He made it perfectly clear that the U.S. was now going to use its military to choke off Venezuela's oil exports. At that point, there was no going back.
And with that one declaration, the whole conflict entered its final act. The U.S. blockade sent absolute shockwaves around the world. It drew sharp lines in the sand, geopolitically speaking, and forced nations everywhere to pick a side.
The reaction from around the world? Man, it was instant and it was completely split down the middle. In the region, countries like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, who have their own issues with Venezuela, they backed the U.S. But a powerful group of opponents, including Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba, fiercely condemned it. You could see the hemisphere splitting into two clear camps.
And the other big players on the world stage? Well, they didn't waste any time jumping in. Russia didn't just put out a press release, it sent actual military hardware, air defense systems to Venezuela. China, which is the #1 customer for Venezuela's sanctioned oil, was firmly against any interference. And Iran called the whole thing a threat to global peace. Suddenly, the fight in the Caribbean had become a proxy battle for the entire world. And as if a naval blockade wasn't enough, a whole other front opened up in cyberspace. Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, got hammered by a massive cyber attack that took its systems totally offline and stopped all oil deliveries. Now, the U.S. was never officially linked to it, but PDVSA immediately pointed the finger at Washington, adding this whole new layer of modern hybrid warfare to the crisis.
So what's the bottom line here? What does all this mean? Operation Southern Spear didn't just blockade a country. It completely redrew the geopolitical chessboard, and it has some huge long-term implications for how nations are going to use their economic and military power from now on. So let's really break down what changed here. First, this set a brand new precedent, using your military to enforce economic sanctions. Economic warfare isn't just about banks and regulations anymore. It's now officially kinetic. Second, this whole operation was a direct shot across the bow at that shadow fleet system, putting not just Venezuela, but also Russia and Iran on notice. This strategy is way more surgical than broad sanctions. It's about targeting the specific financial lifelines that keep a hostile government afloat.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling question. The events of 2025 in the Caribbean combined military force, economic warfare, and a laser focus on strategic resources. So as the worldwide competition for these resources just gets more and more intense, could Operation Southern Spear be the blueprint for how future global conflicts are fought?